The moment Maria Hayes stepped off the stagecoach into the dust-choked streets of Coldwater Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1874, she made herself a single, ironclad promise. She would build a life here on her own terms, and no sunburned, spurred, drawling cowboy would ever be part of it. She had good reason for that promise, and the reason had a name, and the name was Thomas Beaumont. And Thomas Beaumont had broken her heart so thoroughly back in St. Louis that she could still feel the fracture lines on quiet nights, when the wind moved through the eaves of whatever roof she happened to be sleeping under. Thomas had been broad-shouldered and charming in the way that men who spend their days on horseback sometimes are, all easy confidence and slow smiles and the smell of leather and open sky. He had courted her for 14 months, asked her father for her hand, accepted the family's blessing, and then quietly, without drama or explanation, ridden west with a woman named Clara from a saloon on the river road. No letter, no apology, just a hollow space where a future had been. So Maria had sold the small inheritance her mother had left her, packed her doctor's journals, her medicinal texts, her surgical instruments, and the battered leather bag she had carried since her years assisting the physician Dr. Elias Crane in St. Louis, and she had come west herself. Not for a man, not for romance, for a purpose. Coldwater Creek had advertised for a physician in the Missouri papers, and no qualified doctor had answered, and Maria Hayes, trained rigorously under Crane and more capable than half the licensed men she had ever met, had answered instead. The town of Coldwater Creek sat in a wide, sun-hammered valley in central Texas, a place of hard clay earth and scrub oak, and a creek that ran clear and cold in March and nearly dry in August. The population numbered somewhere around 400 souls, depending on how many ranch hands were riding through. There was a general store run by a heavyset man named Gerald Prout, a livery stable, a telegraph office that worked on its best days, 2 saloons, a church with a bell that had cracked the previous winter and sung flat ever since, and a single-room schoolhouse where a young woman named Dolores Vega taught the children of ranchers and farmers, and the occasional child of a passing family that had stopped long enough to put down temporary roots. There was no doctor. There had not been one for 2 years, since old Dr. Harlan Poole had drunk himself to death over the course of a particularly bitter winter. Maria rented a 2-room building on the main street between the telegraph office and the feed store, hung a painted wooden sign that read M. Hayes, Physician, and waited to see whether the town would accept her or turn her away. It did neither exactly. The town watched her with cautious, sidelong curiosity. The women came first, tentatively, with their children's fevers and their own persistent aches, because there was no pride involved in a woman seeing another woman about a female matter. The men came later, reluctantly, after their wives insisted or after the pain became too large to ignore. Within 3 weeks, Maria had set 2 broken arms, treated a case of influenza that had swept through the Prout family, lanced an infected wound on the hand of a ranch hand named Davis who had been quietly terrified he would lose the arm, and delivered a baby boy to Elena and Rodrigo Vega, Dolores' brother and sister-in-law, at 2 in the morning on a night when the stars over Texas were so thick and bright they seemed almost aggressive in their beauty. She was tired. She was satisfied. She was, for the first time in nearly a year, not thinking about Thomas Beaumont. That was when Louis Finley walked into her life, which is to say that Louis Finley walked into her examination room with his hat in both hands and a deep gash along his left forearm that needed stitching, and which he had been ignoring for 4 days before Dolores Vega, who seemed to know everyone in the county, had finally lost her patience with him and told him to stop being foolish and go see the doctor. He was 26 years old, lean and weathered in the way that men who work outdoors in the Texas sun tend to be by that age, with dark hair that wanted cutting and eyes the particular shade of brown that reminded Maria, against her will, of warm coffee on a cold morning. He was not the most handsome man she had ever seen, but there was something in the way he held himself, a kind of considered steadiness, that made a room feel calmer when he entered it. He wore the boots and the spurs and the denim and the battered hat of a working cowboy, and the moment Maria registered all of that, something in her closed up like a fist. She cleaned the wound anyway. She was a professional. "This is 4 days old," she said, not looking up from his arm as she worked with a dampened cloth. "You can tell by the way the edges have started to try to close on their own. The trouble is they are closing incorrectly, with dirt still in the wound. You are fortunate you do not have a serious infection." "I know it," Louis Finley said. His voice was quiet and a little rough, not from drink but from a life spent calling across distances. "I kept meaning to get to it and then something else would come up." "Something more important than keeping your arm?" Maria asked. 300 cattle and a busted fence line," he said, with the kind of matter-of-fact tone that told her this was simply the reality of his days. "No offense to the arm." She glanced up at him briefly, then back down. "I am going to have to stitch this. It will hurt." "I figured. I have some laudanum I can give you for the pain." "I would rather you did not," he said. "I do not like the way it fogs a person's thinking. I need to drive back to the ranch tonight." She studied the wound a moment longer, then nodded. "Hold still, then." He held still. He did not make a sound through the 6 stitches she placed, though she could feel the tension in his forearm and knew from experience that it was not a painless procedure. When she was finished tying off the last suture, she looked up and found him watching her with an expression that was not quite admiration but was something close to it, a sort of careful, respectful attention. "You are good at that," he said. "I am aware," she replied, and wrapped his arm in clean linen. She told him to come back in a week to have the stitches checked, handed him a small packet of clean cloth and a bottle of disinfecting solution, and named her fee. He paid without comment and stood, replacing his hat. "I am Louis Finley," he said at the door. "I run the Finley quarter circle out on the creek road about 8 miles east. My father built it. I have been running it for 3 years now." "Maria Hayes," she said, because it seemed impolite not to respond at all. "As the sign says." "Yes, ma'am," he smiled, small and genuine. "Thank you, Miss Hayes." He left. She watched the door close behind him, then went to the window and watched him climb easily onto a gray horse that stood hipshot at the rail outside, gather the reins, and ride east without looking back. She noticed the way he sat a horse, relaxed and natural, as if the animal were simply an extension of himself, and she told herself firmly that she had noticed it the same way she would have noticed the gait of a person with a limp, purely clinically, with no further significance. She washed her hands and went back to her journals. He returned in a week as she had instructed, and she checked the stitches and found them holding beautifully. The wound was clean, pink, healing well. She told him so. "I did everything you said," he told her. "That makes you unusual," she said dryly. "Most of my patients hear my instructions, agree solemnly to follow them, and then do whatever they were going to do anyway." He smiled at that, wider than the first time, and she noticed against her absolute will that it was a good smile, the kind that started slow and then arrived fully, like sunrise. "I will take the unusual as a compliment." She removed the stitches and told him he was healed. He paid her again, which she tried to refuse since it was simply a follow-up to the original visit, but he was firm about it. "You came out here alone and set up a practice in a town that did not know what to make of you," he said. "The least this town can do is pay you properly." She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing and he left, and she told herself that was the end of it. It was not the end of it. Louis Finley came back to Coldwater Creek the following Saturday, not as a patient, but because Saturdays were when the ranchers and ranch hands came to town to do their buying and catch up on the week's news and occasionally drink at one of the 2 saloons. Maria was in the general store selecting supplies when he came in behind Gerald Prout with a list of his own, and he tipped his hat to her with a simple, unperformative courtesy that she found, to her annoyance, quite pleasant. They ended up standing at the same counter waiting for Prout to fill their respective orders, And because silence in that context would have been more pointed than conversation, Maria spoke first. "How is the arm?" "Perfect," he said, holding it up and rotating it to demonstrate its full range of motion. "Not even a pull." "Good." She looked back at Prute's broad back. "How is the fence line?" She was not sure why she asked that. She had remembered it without meaning to, from what he had said during his treatment. Louis turned to look at her with an expression that suggested he was pleasantly surprised. "Fixed," he said. "Finally. Took the better part of a week. 300 head of cattle do not stay where they are told when there is an opening." "I imagine they do not," Maria said. A small silence settled between them, not uncomfortable exactly, more like the space before a sentence rather than the space after one. "I heard what you did for Elena Vega," he said then. "Rodrigo told half the county. He was terrified, said you were calm as still water the whole time." Maria felt a flush of something, not quite pride but something adjacent to it. "Delivering babies is not calm work," she said honestly. "It is deeply uncertain work. I was only calm on the outside." "That is what courage looks like, is it not?" Louis said simply. He said it without any trace of flattery or performance, just as a plain observation, the way a man who spends his days reading weather and terrain says what he sees. Then Prute called his name and he moved to the other end of the counter, and Maria stood with her supplies and her unwilling thoughts and felt, for the first time in a long time, as if the walls she had built after Thomas Beaumont might be slightly less solid than she had believed. She did not like that feeling. She reminded herself, carefully and firmly, of exactly what Thomas had been and exactly what Louis Finley was, which was also a cowboy, which was the whole problem. The weeks that followed had a pattern to them that Maria did not engineer, but found herself living inside anyway. On Saturday mornings she did her supply runs, and on Saturday mornings Louis Finley often did his, and the general store was small, and Coldwater Creek was small, and there was simply not a great deal of way to avoid a person who was unfailingly polite and not particularly trying to impose himself. They began to talk. Not in long, sweeping conversations, not yet, but in the accumulated small exchanges of a town where people's lives overlapped. He told her about the quarter circle, about the small herd of horses he was beginning to develop alongside the cattle operation, about how his father had come from Kentucky in 1851, with nothing but a mule and a dream that had turned, through backbreaking years, into one of the more respectable spreads in the county. His father had died 2 years ago, and his mother had gone back east to her sister, and Louis had taken the ranch and run it forward because it was the only thing in the world he knew how to do, and because his father had died loving that land, and Louis thought that was a good enough reason to love it too. Maria found herself telling him things in return, not all at once but in pieces, the way that trust is actually built slowly, honestly, without grand gestures. She told him about her training under Dr. Crane, about the resistance she had faced from the male physicians in St. Louis who believed medicine was a man's occupation, and her presence in it was either a joke or a threat. She told him about the satisfaction of a correct diagnosis, about the particular exhaustion of a night delivery followed immediately by a morning full of patients. She did not tell him about Thomas Beaumont. That was a story she kept close. But she was aware, as May settled into June, and the Texas heat began to assert its full, merciless authority, that she looked forward to Saturday mornings. She was aware that when she heard the specific sound of a gray horse at her hitching post, which was distinguishable because the animal had an irritable habit of pawing the ground twice before standing, something in her chest responded before her brain caught up. She was aware that she had begun noticing the way Louis Finley said her name, which was simply Miss Hayes, but which he said with a quality of genuine regard that made it sound like more than a formal address. She was aware of all of this and she was not pleased about it, not because Louis had given her any reason for displeasure, but because she had been here before, in the particular warm country of beginning feelings for a man who rode horses for a living, and she knew what the terrain looked like and she knew where it could lead. It was the last Saturday in June when she finally said it, and she said it because Louis had brought her wildflowers, which was entirely too much. They were not fancy wildflowers. They were the small, scrubby, blue-purple prairie verbena that grew along the creek road, the kind that a person might gather without much thought while riding, and he had brought them wrapped in a piece of brown paper from the supply store and left them with Gerald Prout to give to her when she came in, without a note or an explanation, just the flowers. And Gerald had handed them over with a knowing look that Maria found deeply irritating, and she had gone home and put them in a glass of water because they were flowers and they deserved water. And then she had sat looking at them for a long time with something very close to tenderness working in her chest. And that was exactly the problem. The following Saturday she waited until they were alone in the store, and she said, without preamble, looking him directly in the eye the way she had learned to look at difficult situations directly, "Mr. Finley, I want to be honest with you, because I think you deserve honesty more than comfortable vagueness." Louis went still in the way he did when he was listening carefully. "All right," he said. "I will not love a cowboy," Maria said. The words were clear and steady, and she meant them, or she was trying to mean them, which was perhaps not quite the same thing. "I have been down that road. I know what it looks like and I know what it costs. I am not willing to pay that cost again. So if that is what you are working toward with the flowers and the Saturdays, then I think it is kinder to us both if we acknowledge what it is and what it cannot become." Louis looked at her for a long moment. He did not look stung. He did not look offended. He looked, if anything, thoughtful, the way a man looks when he is considering a problem he takes seriously. The silence stretched to 4 seconds, 5, 6, long enough that Maria began to wonder if she had misjudged the whole thing and would need to find a way to walk back from a declaration that had assumed too much. Then Louis Finley said, with that slow, genuine smile, and in a voice that was perfectly quiet and perfectly certain, "Then let me change your mind slowly." Maria blinked. "I am not asking for anything you are not willing to give," he said. "I am not Thomas Beaumont, whoever he is. But I think you are the most interesting person who has come to this valley in as long as I can remember, and I am not ready to pretend I did not notice that. So I will be slow, and I will be patient, and I will be honest, and if at the end of all that you still will not love a cowboy, then I will accept that and I will be grateful for what time we had. But I would like to try." Maria stared at him. She was a woman accustomed to having responses ready, to thinking quickly and speaking precisely, and she found herself with nothing to say at all, which was its own kind of answer, and they both knew it. "That is presumptuous," she said finally. "I know it," he agreed pleasantly. She took her supplies and she left, and she did not look back, and she sat in her office that afternoon unable to concentrate on her journals, and she thought about the way he had said it, slowly, as if time were something he had enough of and was willing to spend, and she thought that was either the most reckless thing a person could say or the most honest, and she was not entirely sure which. July in Coldwater Creek was a brutal thing, the heat pressing down from a sky bleached nearly white, the creek shrinking to a silver trickle between clay banks, the cattle drifting toward whatever shade they could find. Maria worked through it, her small office becoming stifling in the afternoons, though she had rigged a canvas awning outside her window that helped with the direct sun. She treated heat stroke and dehydration and the usual summer ailments of a working ranch community, and she was busy enough that she did not have excessive time to think about things she did not want to think about. Louis came by on a Wednesday in the second week of July, not Saturday, which was irregular, and she felt the irregularity of it before she saw him through the window. He was not injured and he was not sick. He was carrying a wooden crate with a latched lid. "What is that?" Maria asked, standing in her doorway. "A gift," he said. "A practical one." She stepped aside to let him in because refusing a practical gift felt unnecessarily rude, and he set the crate on her examining table and unlatched it, and she looked inside, and there was a block of actual ice, wrapped in burlap to slow its melting, and nestled beside it, a mechanical fan, the small clockwork kind that had to be wound every half hour but that moved air with genuine effectiveness. Maria looked at the crate. She looked at Louis. "Where did you get ice in July in Texas?" she asked. "There is a man named Kowalski 3 towns east," Louis said. "He has an underground ice house. He cut and stored the creek ice in February. I rode over last Tuesday and made a deal. He is going to send a delivery once a week for the rest of the summer. It will come to the livery and someone will bring it here." He looked at the crate. "Your patients are going to be more comfortable, and so are you." "Mr. Finley," Maria said, and she heard something in her own voice that she did not entirely intend. "That is very thoughtful." "I told you I would be patient," he said simply. "Patient does not mean absent." He left before she could say anything more, and she stood in her office with a block of July ice and a clockwork fan and the strange, unwanted warmth of being cared for, genuinely cared for, in a practical and attentive way. And she thought about his words again, and she thought that Thomas Beaumont had never once brought her ice. The ice came every Thursday through the rest of the summer, and the clockwork fan became a fixture on her windowsill. And if the patients who came in during the blazing afternoon hours remarked on how much cooler the doctor's office was than anywhere else in Coldwater Creek, Maria simply said she had made arrangements and did not elaborate. What changed the calculus again, what brought things from the gradual slope of ordinary warmth to something steeper and more undeniable, was the situation with the Harmon family in August. The Harmons were recent arrivals, a family of 4, Father Dale, Mother Susan, and 2 children, 8-year-old Samuel and 11-year-old Ruth, who had come down from Kansas in a covered wagon and had been attempting to build a homestead on a piece of scrub land east of town. They were not making a success of it. They had arrived late in the season with insufficient capital, and Dale Harmon, while a decent enough man, was not a particularly experienced farmer or rancher, and by August it was clear to nearly everyone in Coldwater Creek that the Harmons were in serious difficulty. Maria knew because Susan Harmon had come to see her twice, once for a minor infection in her daughter's hand, and once simply because she was exhausted and depleted and needed someone to tell her that she was not losing her mind, that the situation was genuinely hard, and her body's response to hard things was appropriate and not a sign of weakness. Maria had spent an hour with her, no charge, talking about practical measures, about nutrition and rest and managing anxiety. And she had gone home that evening thinking about the way the world arranges itself, so that the people who can least afford the cost of difficulty are so often the ones who bear the most of it. She mentioned the Harmons to Louis the following Saturday without quite intending to, because he had asked how her week had been and she had told him honestly, and mentioning the Harmons was part of an honest answer. "I know them," Louis said, "or I know of them. They are on the Creek Road about 2 miles west of my place." "They are struggling," Maria said. Louis was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "I have been thinking about that." The following week, Maria learned through Dolores Vega, who was the effective information center of Coldwater Creek, that Louis Finley had ridden over to the Harmon place and spent 2 days helping Dale Harmon dig and reinforce a proper root cellar, bringing 2 of his own hands with him, and had sent over a side of smoked beef and a sack of dried beans and corn, and had introduced Dale to his own supplier of winter stores, and had done all of this quietly, without announcement or expectation of credit. Maria heard this from Dolores on a Tuesday, and she sat with it all the way through until Sunday, turning it over with a kind of reluctant, helpless admiration. This was not the gesture of a man performing generosity for an audience. This was what Louis Finley was when no one he was trying to impress was watching. And something about that, something about the gap between what a person does in public and what they do in private, felt more important to her than almost anything else a person could show her. She went to the quarter circle on Sunday afternoon for the first time. She had not been invited exactly, but she had not been uninvited either, and she told herself she was going because she wanted to see the horses he had mentioned, which was true, just not entirely the whole truth. The Finley quarter circle was 8 miles east of town on a road that wound through scrub oak and dried grass and crossed the creek twice on flat stone fords. She drove her small buggy and arrived at a ranch that was not grand but was deeply well tended, the fences straight and solid, the outbuildings in good repair, the house a low, wide wooden structure with a covered porch that faced southwest to catch the evening breeze. Louis was in the corral with a young horse, a chestnut with white stockings, working it quietly on a long rope, and he looked up when her buggy came through the gate, and his expression was not surprised exactly, more like pleased in a careful way, as if he had not allowed himself to expect this and was therefore especially glad of it. He let the rope hang loose and walked to the corral fence and leaned against it. "Miss Hayes," he said, "this is a nice surprise." "I heard about what you did for the Harmons," she said, without preamble, because she was not good at circling around things. "I wanted to tell you that I thought it was a fine thing to do." "It was a neighborly thing to do," he said. "Nothing more than that." "You know that is not how most people operate," she said. He looked at her steadily. "I know it, but most people are too busy being afraid that there is not enough to go around. There usually is, you just have to be willing to share it." Maria stepped down from the buggy and tied the horse to the fence, and Louis opened the corral gate and they walked along the paddock fence, and he showed her the horses, 3 breeding mares and the young chestnut and an older gray that was his personal mount. And she asked him questions about them because she found she genuinely wanted to know, and he answered them with the clear, detailed pleasure of a person talking about something they love. Then they sat on the porch with cups of coffee that he made on the iron stove inside, strong and black, and the late afternoon light went golden over the valley, and the scrub oaks threw long shadows, and the cattle in the far pasture were dark shapes against the dried grass, and it was very quiet in the particular, textured way that the Texas countryside is quiet, full of bird sounds and insect sounds and the occasional moan of wind through the gullies. "Tell me about the cowboy," Louis said. Maria turned to look at him. "What cowboy?" "The one that made you swear off cowboys," he said. He was not pressing. He was asking the way he asked everything, directly but gently, as if he understood that some questions needed to be received like a hand extended across a distance, not like a demand. Maria was quiet for a moment. She looked at the valley. "His name was Thomas Beaumont," she said. "He was charming and he was handsome and he was good with horses. He courted me for over a year. He asked my father for permission to marry me. My father said yes. I thought I was going to have a life with him." She stopped, took a breath. "He left with someone else. No explanation, no apology, just gone." Louis said nothing for a moment. "Then, I am sorry. That is a terrible thing to do to a person." Maria agreed. "It is also a very clarifying thing. It tells you something about a person's character that no amount of courtship can reveal. The leaving does what the courting conceals." "That is true," Louis said quietly. "And I understand why you would not want to risk that again." He set down his coffee cup and looked at her directly. "I will not tell you that I am different, because every man who means to hurt a woman thinks he is different right up until the moment he hurts her. What I will tell you is that my character has been the same since I was old enough to have one, and that the people in this valley who have known me longest will tell you so. You can ask any of them." "I know," Maria said. "I have been asking, not obviously, but I have been asking." Louis looked at her with something that might have been delight. "Have you?" "I am a thorough woman," Maria said. "I do not make decisions without gathering information." "And what did your information gathering tell you?" She looked at him. "That you are exactly who you appear to be," she said, "which is either reassuring or the most frightening thing I have ever heard." He laughed at that, a real laugh, warm and genuine, and Maria felt it somewhere in her chest, and she stopped fighting the feeling quite as hard as she had been. She drove back to town in the blue dusk with the first stars coming out over Texas and her thoughts in a state of pleasant disorder, and she thought that slowly was maybe not such a terrible pace after all. August gave way to September, and September in central Texas is a mercy after the brutality of summer, the heat backing off just enough to make the outdoors bearable, the light going from white to gold, the evenings coming earlier and cooler, and carrying the smell of dry grass and distant rain. Maria and Louis developed a rhythm that was theirs, particular and private, built of small consistencies that meant more than they announced. He came to town every Saturday. She came to the quarter circle every other Sunday. On the Sundays she came, he made coffee, and she brought the weekly newspaper from the telegraph office, which arrived Thursdays from San Antonio, and they read items from it aloud and argued about politics and economics, and what the future of the cattle trade would look like once the railroads extended their reach further into Texas, which everyone seemed to agree was imminent. Maria had opinions about the railroad. She had opinions about the cattle trade, about the treatment of the Mexican ranch hands who made up a significant portion of the workforce in the valley and who were paid less than the Anglo hands for identical work, a fact that struck her as plainly unjust. She had opinions about the condition of the Comanche and Kiowa peoples who had been displaced from this very land within living memory, driven from their territory by force and treaty violation and violence, a history that sat beneath the beauty of the valley like a shadow, present and unspoken. She had opinions about women's suffrage, which had been granted in Wyoming Territory in 1869 and which she thought was long overdue everywhere else. Louis listened to all of it. He did not always agree, but he was never dismissive. He engaged with her arguments seriously, challenged the ones he thought were wrong with evidence rather than authority, and occasionally said things like, "I had not considered it from that angle," which she found profoundly satisfying in a way that went beyond mere agreement. "You are not what I expected," she told him one September evening, as the last light faded over the valley and they sat on the porch in the cooling air. "What did you expect?" he asked. "A man whose world was 8 miles wide," she said, "cattle and horses and fence lines." "My world is 8 miles wide," he said, "but that does not mean I cannot think about what is outside it." He paused. "My father used to say that the trouble with people who think small thoughts is not that they do not care about big things. It is that they have never been given reason to see how the big things connect to them. I try to see the connections." "Your father sounds like he was a wise man," Maria said. "He was," Louis said, and there was a weight to the word that told her the loss of him was still something Louis carried, not heavily but always. "He was also stubborn and wrong about a fair number of things, as most wise people are, but he built something in this valley that I am proud to tend." Maria watched his face in the fading light and thought that this was it. This was the thing she had not been willing to account for, that some men build things and tend them and mean them, and that was an entirely different kind of man from the kind who rides away. She reached out and put her hand over his where it rested on the arm of his chair. She did not say anything. He turned his hand palm up and held hers, and they sat like that until the stars were fully out and the coyotes started their evening conversation somewhere out in the hills, and it was the most content Maria Hayes had felt in years. She rode home in the dark with her lantern swinging and her heart in a state of quiet revolution, and she thought, against all her resolutions and against all her protective instincts, that she was in serious danger of loving a cowboy after all. The crisis, when it came from an unexpected direction. In October, a man arrived in Coldwater Creek who introduced himself as Harold Driscoll, a land agent representing a consortium of Eastern investors who had identified the Coldwater Creek Valley as a promising site for large-scale cattle operations. Driscoll was a compact, precise man with city clothes and a city manner, and he went from property to property in the valley with a leather briefcase and a practiced smile, making offers on parcels of land that sounded generous until you looked at the fine print, which revealed long-term lease arrangements that essentially ceded control of the water rights along the creek to the consortium. Maria learned about Driscoll from several of her patients, each of whom told the story with varying degrees of anxiety, before she met him herself in the general store on a Wednesday, where Prout introduced them and Driscoll looked at her sign in the window with polite incomprehension and said, "A woman doctor. How progressive," in a tone that managed to be both complimentary and condescending simultaneously. Maria told him that medicine was a practical art, and that sick people did not much care about the gender of the person treating them, and she moved on. The more pressing concern was what Driscoll was after with the water rights. The creek was the central arterial system of the valley's ranches and farms. Whoever controlled the water controlled everything, and in a dry Texas summer that was not a metaphor but a matter of survival. Louis had received an offer. He told Maria about it on the following Sunday, laying the papers on the table between their coffee cups. "He is offering a good price per acre," Louis said. "On the surface." "On the surface," Maria agreed, reading through the papers. She was a careful reader, trained in the close parsing of medical texts, and legal documents were not so different. She found what she was looking for in the fourth paragraph. Here, the water rights conveyance clause. He is not buying the land outright. He is buying a controlling interest in the creek access, which he retains regardless of the land transaction's outcome. "That is what I read too," Louis said, "which means even if I sold nothing but a small parcel on the east boundary, he and his consortium would have legal standing to dictate water usage for the whole creek." "Have the other ranchers read this carefully?" "I do not know," Louis said. "The Harmons certainly have not. They are not practiced readers of contracts. The Torres family probably has. Carmen Torres is sharp as they come. But some of the others—" "Then someone needs to tell them," Maria said. She and Louis spent the next 3 days riding to every ranch and homestead in the Creek Valley, 8 properties in all, and sitting with each family and going through the Driscoll papers and explaining the water rights clause in plain language. It was hard riding and longer conversations, and twice they were offered meals they could not refuse without giving offense, and once they were met with initial skepticism from a rancher named Briggs who thought they were overreacting, until Maria laid the contract flat on his kitchen table and pointed out the exact language, at which point Briggs went very quiet and then very angry. By the end of the 3 days, every property owner in the valley had declined Driscoll's offer, and Driscoll, facing a unified front, departed Coldwater Creek with his leather briefcase and his practiced smile somewhat dimmed, and the valley was intact. On the ride back from the last ranch, in the late afternoon with the October light going amber and the air carrying the first real bite of approaching winter, Louis reined his horse alongside Maria's buggy and said, "You did not have to do that." "Of course I did," Maria said. "It was the right thing." "It cost you 2 full days of seeing patients," he said. "And a significant amount of riding, which I know is not your preferred mode of travel." "The patients will come back," Maria said. "The water rights once signed away would not have." She paused. "Besides, these are my people too now. This is my valley as much as anyone's. When you have chosen a place, you are responsible for it." Louis looked at her for a long moment, riding alongside her in the amber light, the horses moving at the same easy pace as if they had agreed between themselves. "When did you decide that?" he asked. "That this was your place?" Maria thought about it honestly. "Sometime in August," she said, "on a porch with a cup of coffee." He smiled at that, full and slow, and she smiled back because she could not help it. And they rode the rest of the way back to town in the October light with that smile still between them like a warm thing. He walked her to her door that evening, which he had not done before, and they stood on the small porch of her office home with the lights of Coldwater Creek spreading out behind him and the cold clear October stars overhead. And Maria thought, this is the moment. This is the place where the story turns. And she felt not afraid of it but ready. The way you feel ready for a change of season you have been watching approach for weeks. "Maria," he said, and it was the first time he had used her first name, and it settled in the air between them like the first note of a melody that has been only humming until now. "Louis," she said. He looked at her for a moment with all that careful, steady attention, and she thought about all the ways that a person shows you who they are, not in the dramatic moments but in the daily ones, in the ice delivery in July and the neighborly labor and the contract reading and the way he listened, truly listened, as if her words were worth keeping. "I am not asking you to love a cowboy," he said softly. "I am asking if you might be willing to love me." The distinction was so precise and so right that Maria felt something give way in her chest, not painfully but like a door opening, warm air coming through. "I think," she said slowly, with the honesty she had promised herself she would always bring to things that mattered, "that I am already failing at not loving you, and I think I have been failing for a while." He stepped close and cupped her face in his hands, carefully, with the same gentleness he brought to young horses and frightened patients, and he kissed her in the October night under the cracked bell stars of Coldwater Creek, and it was nothing like the showy, self-conscious kisses of men who are performing romance. It was simply, completely, undeniably real. She kissed him back. The stars were very bright. The creek, somewhere in the middle distance, was making its patient way over the stones. And Maria Hayes, who had sworn on a stagecoach platform 8 months ago that she would never love a cowboy, stood on her own porch in the Texas night and loved one unreservedly, and felt, for the first time since before Thomas Beaumont, that the future was not a wound but a door. November came in cool and purposeful, the way November does in Texas, nothing like the brutal winters of the North but carrying its own quiet authority, the mornings sharp and silver, the afternoon light clean and short. Maria settled into the particular happiness of a person who has stopped fighting what they want and found that wanting it was the easy part, that having it was simply a daily deepening, like a creek cutting its bed deeper into the stone, patient and perpetual. She and Louis did not announce themselves to Coldwater Creek. They did not need to. The town, which had been watching with the particular intense interest of a small community that observes its members closely, and with great investment, simply arrived at a shared understanding, communicated in the way that small-town understanding is communicated, through nods and small smiles, and a marked decrease in the matchmaking suggestions that several of the older women had been inflicting on Maria since her arrival. Dolores Vega, who had been quietly cheering for this development since approximately the moment she had told Louis to stop being foolish and see the doctor about his arm, came to Maria's office on a Wednesday morning in November, ostensibly about a slight cough, and spent the better part of 30 minutes asking questions about Louis Finley that were not about medicine. Maria answered them with a composure she did not quite feel and told Dolores that her cough was minor and that she should drink more water, and Dolores left looking thoroughly satisfied. The Harmon family had stabilized, partly due to Louis's initial help and partly due to the community of the valley folding them in gradually, the way small Western communities do when someone is genuinely trying and simply needs a hand over the roughest ground. Dale Harmon had found work as a carpenter's assistant, which suited his actual skills better than farming, and Susan Harmon had begun taking in sewing, and their children Samuel and Ruth were attending Dolores Vega's school 5 days a week and were, according to Dolores, bright and curious and adapting well. In December, there was a Christmas gathering at the church, the cracked bell ringing its flat note into the cold night, and nearly everyone in the valley came for the potluck supper and the singing and the distribution of small gifts among the children. Maria came with a dish of cornbread and a crock of honey, and Louis came with a roasted side of pork that fed perhaps 30 people on its own, and they sat together without any particular concealment or announcement, and the gathered community of Coldwater Creek saw them and was quietly, collectively pleased. Gerald Prout, whose sentimentality was one of the worst-kept secrets in the valley, got a little emotional about it and had to go outside briefly to check on his horses, which no one required him to check on. After the supper and the singing, they walked out together into the cold December night, their breath making small clouds in the air, the stars above the valley as numerous and indifferent as ever, and Louis said, looking up at them, "I want to ask you something." "Ask it," Maria said. He looked at her, not at the stars, with all the steady, measured certainty that was simply how he was in the world. "I want to marry you," he said, "when you are ready, if you are ever ready. I am not in a hurry and I am not setting a condition, but I wanted you to know that is where I am and where I intend to stay." Maria turned and looked at him in the cold starlight, this man who had offered her slowness and delivered it faithfully, who had rebuilt her willingness to trust without once demanding credit for doing so. She thought about the promise she had made to herself on the stagecoach platform, and she thought about how it had felt in that moment like wisdom, and how it had turned out to be something closer to a wound scar tissue, protective but also limiting. "I am ready," she said. He looked at her, and she could see even in the starlight that he had not quite expected that he had genuinely meant it when he said he was not in a hurry, that he had prepared himself for patience, and now found that patience rewarded without the weight he had anticipated. "You are sure?" he asked. "I have been sure for at least 6 weeks," she said. "I was simply waiting for you to ask." He laughed, and she laughed with him. There in the cold Texas night with the cracked bell church behind them and the valley stretching out dark and quiet all around. And then he reached into his jacket pocket and produced a ring, which made her stop laughing in pure surprise. "You had it with you," she said. "I have been carrying it for 6 weeks," he said, slightly abashed. "It was my mother's. I wrote to her in September when I started thinking about asking you, and she sent it. I have been working up to the right moment ever since." It was a simple gold band with a small turquoise stone, the kind of ring that had been made and worn with love and had that quality to it, an accumulated tenderness in the metal. Maria held out her hand and he put it on her finger, and it fit as if it had been made for her. 6 weeks, she said. "I was being slow," he said. "You said you liked slow." She kissed him in the cold December night and thought that the best decisions were the ones you stopped regretting long before you made them. They were married in March of 1875, on a Saturday morning when the prairie verbena was just beginning to bloom along the creek road, small and blue-purple and persistent. The ceremony was in the Crackbell Church, which did its flat best, and the whole of Coldwater Creek and a good portion of the Creek Valley attended. Dolores Vega cried openly and unapologetically. Elena and Rodrigo Vega were there with their baby boy, who was by now 5 months old and in possession of a considerable amount of dark hair. The Harmon family came, all 4 of them, and Dale Harmon shook Louis's hand with a sincerity that had nothing to do with social obligation and everything to do with genuine gratitude. Maria wore a dress of cream-colored cotton that she had ordered through Prute's store, and she carried a small bunch of whatever wildflowers were blooming along the creek road that morning, which Louis had gathered at dawn and left in a glass of water by her door with a note that said only, "Some things stay the same." She had stood in her doorway reading that note and felt a kind of happiness that had no sharp edges, a happiness that was simply itself, without anxiety or qualification. The minister, a thin, patient man named Brother Caldwell, read the words and they said the words back. And when he said, "You may kiss your bride," Louis kissed her with a quiet certainty that made Dolores Vega cry harder and made Gerald Prute go outside to check on his horses again. And Maria kissed him back in front of everyone without one particle of reservation. After the wedding, they threw a celebration that lasted most of the afternoon in the open space beside the church. Tables brought out and laden with food that every family in the valley had contributed. Music from a fiddle player named Soto, who played with the passionate, improvisational spirit of someone for whom music was a physical need. People danced in the dust and the spring sunshine, and Maria danced with Louis in a way that she had not danced since before Thomas Beaumont, with her whole self. She moved her things to the quarter circle that same week, piece by piece in her buggy, Her journals and her medical bag and her instruments and the clockwork fan that had been a gift in July and the glass she had kept wildflowers in since September. She kept her office in town. She was still the doctor of Coldwater Creek, and a marriage did not change that, and Louis had never suggested it should. If anything, his understanding that her work was part of who she was, not separate from her but continuous with her, was one of the things she loved about him most specifically. Life at the quarter circle had a different texture than life alone in town. The ranch was alive with activity in ways that the town was not. The sounds of cattle and horses and wind in the grass. The rhythm of seasons felt more directly in the work of the land. Maria found herself learning things she had not expected to learn: how to read the sky for weather, how to manage the kitchen garden that she expanded with vegetables useful for her medical practice, how to identify the grasses that indicated good water beneath the soil. Louis taught her these things without making a lesson of them, simply by living alongside her and letting her observe and ask. She taught him things too. He was, it turned out, a natural nurse, patient and calm with sick animals and sick people alike, and she began involving him more formally in her work, teaching him the principles of wound cleaning and basic anatomy, things that a ranch manager needed to know anyway, and which he absorbed with the same careful attention he brought to everything. The spring of 1875 was good, the winter rains having been sufficient to fill the creek and lay down a healthy grass year. The quarter-circle cattle were fat, and the calf crop was strong, and Louis sold a string of 4 well-broke horses to a ranch up near San Antonio at prices that pleased him considerably. The Harmons were doing better, Dale Harmon having established a small carpentry business that was already drawing work from 3 ranches. Dollar's Vegas school had grown to 19 students. In the summer, Maria discovered she was expecting a child. She knew it before she would have told anyone else, from the particular evidence of her own body that her training made impossible to misread, and she spent several days simply knowing it privately, turning it over in the quiet way she turned over large things. She told Louis on a July evening, sitting on the same porch where they had first really talked, the same view of the valley open before them, the same coffee that had been the currency of so many of their best conversations. She said it plainly, because that was how she said things that mattered. "We are going to have a child." Louis was very still for a moment, and then he set down his coffee cup very carefully on the porch railing as if it were fragile, which it was not, and turned to look at her with an expression that she had never quite seen on his face before, a kind of open, unguarded wonder that was both entirely characteristic and entirely new. "Maria," he said, just her name. Nothing else, but it contained everything. She took his hand and held it, and they sat in the July heat looking out over the valley that was theirs, the land and the sky and the creek and the cattle and the scrub oaks and the big pale stars of Texas. And the weight of what they were building here was very present and very fine. She continued seeing patients through her pregnancy, though she arranged coverage for her longer cases with a physician in the next town who was willing to come out for emergencies. The community of Coldwater Creek watched over her with a collective attentiveness that she found touching and occasionally slightly overwhelming. Gerald Prout saved the freshest eggs for her. Dollar's Vega sent over a bowl of something hot and nourishing every 3 or 4 days. Elena Vega, who had navigated her own pregnancy recently enough to remember it precisely, was an invaluable practical resource and companion. Louis was a steady, undemonstrative presence throughout, which was exactly right. He did not treat her as if she were fragile, because she was not fragile, but he made small adjustments to their daily life that eased her work without calling attention to themselves. The way the good arrangements are always made, quietly and without requiring gratitude. In late November of 1875, Maria gave birth to a boy. The labor was long and honest, and Maria, who had attended dozens of deliveries, found that being on the other side of the process had a particular texture she had not anticipated, a surrendering of control that her precise, capable nature resisted until it simply could not resist any longer. And then there was only the large animal fact of it. And then there was a boy, red-faced and furious and perfectly healthy. And Louis, who had been beside her for the whole of it, said something that was barely intelligible because his voice had gone entirely unreliable. And Maria held her son and felt the world rearrange itself around this new center. They named him Robert James Finley, Robert for Louis's father and James for Maria's. They called him simply Robert most of the time, though Dolores Vega called him Bobby from the first moment she met him, and the name stuck in that context, because Dolores was the kind of person whose naming choices settled and stayed. Robert was from the beginning a large, healthy, curious child, slow to fuss and quick to observe, with Louis's dark hair and Maria's precise, evaluating eyes. He watched the world from his earliest weeks with an attention that his mother recognized as characteristic of the kind of person who does not miss much, and his father recognized as the same quality he had been watching in his mother since the July she arrived on a stagecoach with a doctor's bag and no intention of loving a cowboy. Christmas of 1875 was the kind of Christmas that becomes a reference point, the one that later years are measured against. The quarter circle was full. Louis's mother had come from the east to see her grandson, a small, bright woman named Florence Finley who wept at the sight of Robert and then recovered herself and announced that he was magnificent and that she was staying through February. The Vega family came for Christmas dinner, all of them, Elena and Rodrigo and their son and Dolores and her parents. The Harmons came, their children Samuel and Ruth carrying between them a wooden carved box that Dale had made for the baby, which was a lovely piece of work that made Maria grateful and Louis tell Dale he had a genuine gift. The house was loud and warm and smelled of food and wood smoke, and Maria sat in the middle of it all with her son in her arms and Louis's hand on her shoulder, and she thought about the stagecoach platform in the spring of the year before, and the promise she had made herself. And she thought that the things we most need sometimes arrive in exactly the form we have decided we cannot accept them in, and that the wisdom is not in the promise but in the willingness to learn better. She thought about Thomas Beaumont briefly, in the way you briefly think about a scar, not with pain but with the distant acknowledgement that it shaped you. He had ridden west with someone else and broken her in a way that had sent her here, to this valley, to this work, to this house, to this man. She would not have chosen the breaking, but she could not, looking around at the life the breaking had set her on the road toward, wish it entirely undone. Florence Finley stayed through March and left in the spring full of instructions for Louis about the kitchen garden, which she had reorganized according to her own considerable convictions, and full of promises to Maria that she would come back in the fall, which she kept. The year 1876 rolled through its seasons over the quarter circle and the valley and the small, busy town of Coldwater Creek. Maria's practice grew. The town had grown too, new families settling in the valley, drawn by the railroad's advance toward San Antonio and the growing stability of the region. And each new family eventually found their way to the small office with the painted sign that said, M. Hayes, Physician, and found themselves in the capable, direct care of Dr. Maria Finley, which was how she had begun to be known, though she kept the Hayes on the sign because it was the name she had arrived under, and there was something she liked about the reminder of it. Robert grew from infant to toddler with the particular speed of small children, who seemed to develop not gradually, but in sudden leaps, each one transforming the person you thought you knew into someone slightly larger and more articulate and more astonishing. He learned to walk on the porch of the quarter circle in October of 1876, 11 months old, pulling himself up on the railing and then simply going, 3 steps and then 4. And Maria watched him from the doorway and felt the particular pride of a mother watching a person who began entirely inside her own body assert the independence that is both the point and the bittersweet edge of the whole enterprise. He learned to say mama and papa with equal clarity and frequency, and he learned the word for horse before the word for any other animal, which surprised no one at the quarter circle. In the early spring of 1877, Maria again found the particular evidence she knew how to read, and she told Louis on a March evening with the prairie verbena coming back along the creek road, because that seemed right, that they would have another child before the year was out. Louis smiled with the full, unhurried warmth that had been the first truly compelling thing she had seen in him, and said, "Robert is going to be insufferable about this." "Robert is 18 months old," Maria said. "He is already insufferable about the horses," Louis said. "He will absolutely be insufferable about a sibling." She laughed, and he laughed, and Robert, who had been sitting on the porch with a wooden horse that Dale Harmon had carved for him, looked up at the sound of his parents laughing and smiled the large, uncomplicated smile of a child who understands nothing about what is being discussed, but knows that happiness is present and wants to be part of it. In October of 1877, their daughter arrived. They named her Clara Louise Finley, and both of them were aware for a moment of the coincidence of the first name, because that had been the name of the woman Thomas Beaumont had ridden away with. But Maria had thought about it beforehand and decided that the name had been hers to reclaim if she chose, that she would not let a ghost hold a good name hostage. And she chose it because she had always liked it, and because Louis had suggested Louise as a middle name for his grandmother, and together the two names ran well. Clara was born with her father's steadiness and her mother's eyes, and a particular quality of alertness that made Dolores Vega, who was present at the delivery, because she had been at the quarter circle having supper when the labor began in earnest, say, "Oh, this one is going to be remarkable," in a tone of genuine awe. Robert, upon being introduced to his sister, observed her for a long and serious moment, and then said horse, with an air of comparison that suggested he found the horse superior in several respects. Maria told Louis about it that evening, and they both laughed until they had to sit down. Coldwater Creek in the autumn of 1877 was a fuller, more settled place than the town Maria had arrived in 3 years earlier. The new railhead was 12 miles east, at a town called Garner's Crossing, and the cattle trade through the valley had expanded accordingly, bringing both prosperity and the complications of prosperity: more people, more commerce, more noise, more of the particular frictions that arise when expansion meets established community. There were newcomers Maria did not know and neighbors she had grown to love, and a town that was in the daily process of deciding what it would become. She was part of that process. She had not expected to be, when she had stepped off the stagecoach with her doctor's bag and her promises to herself, but she was part of it in ways both formal and informal. She served on the newly established town council, the only woman on it, which had been a matter of some brief controversy that had been resolved partly by her own firm argument, and partly by the universal agreement that there was no one in Coldwater Creek better suited to civic responsibility, and once the council had agreed, there was no reasonable objection to be made. She attended to the health of roughly 400 people. She mentored a young woman named Petra, recently arrived from San Antonio, who had expressed a strong interest in medicine, and who Maria had taken on as an assistant with the full intention of helping her get the formal training she deserved. The Harmon family had become central fixtures of the community, Dale Harmon's carpentry being now so sought after that he had taken on 2 apprentices, and Susan Harmon sat on the school board alongside 3 others. Ruth Harmon, now 14, was one of Dolores Vega's most accomplished students and spoke of one day becoming a teacher herself, which Dolores encouraged with the entirety of her considerable enthusiasm. The injustice of the land itself, the history beneath it, was not resolved, because such things are not resolved in 3 years or 30. The Comanche and Kiowa peoples who had lived in this territory before the Anglo and Mexican settlements had been forced from it by a combination of military pressure and treaty violations that had concluded formally just 2 years prior, in 1875, And the weight of that history was something that Maria thought about often, that she had raised with Louis more than once, that sat in the landscape as an undeniable fact for anyone willing to acknowledge it. She could not undo it. She could acknowledge it honestly. She could treat any person who came to her door regardless of their origin or background. She could speak plainly about it in the council meetings when it was relevant, which it sometimes was when land questions arose. It was not enough. She knew it was not enough. She chose to believe that honest acknowledgement and consistent fairness were worth doing even when they were not enough, because the alternative was to look away, and looking away was a thing she had never been able to make herself do. Louis felt the same. He paid his Mexican ranch hands equitably. He taught Robert, from the earliest age Robert could understand anything, that the land they lived on had been lived on before them, and that this deserved both acknowledgement and respect. It was the beginning of an education, the kind that takes a lifetime and never fully arrives, but it was a beginning made in good faith, and Maria thought good faith was where everything had to start. December of 1877 was full and cold and lit by fire, the quarter circle warm and alive with Robert's running feet and Clara's watchful infant eyes and Florence Finley's annual arrival from the East, which had by now become such a fixture of the December calendar that her absence would have been shocking. The house smelled of wood smoke and coffee, and the pine boughs that Louis cut from a stand up in the hills every year and brought back to hang over the door, because his mother had done it and her mother before her. And tradition in a place where so much is new and uncertain is a way of insisting that some things continue. On Christmas Eve, after the children were sleeping and Florence had retired, and the fire had burned to its deep red bed of coals, Maria and Louis sat on the porch in their coats with blankets over them and cups of coffee that were going cold, because neither of them was thinking much about the coffee. The night was clear and cold, and the stars over Texas were their customary overwhelming multitude, the Milky Way a river of light across the sky's center. "Tell me something true," Maria said, which had become their game on quiet evenings, a requirement to say something that was genuinely believed and not merely polite. Louis was quiet for a moment, which was also characteristic of him, that he gave the question its due time rather than answering immediately. Then he said, "I think the best decision I ever made was walking into your office that first time." "You walked into my office because you had ignored a wound for 4 days," Maria said. "Yes," he agreed. "But I could have kept ignoring it. I went because dolors told me to stop being foolish, which I want it noted I followed, and I am very glad I did." Maria laughed softly. "Tell me something true," he said. She looked at the stars. She thought about the stagecoach platform and the promise and the wildflowers wrapped in brown paper and the block of ice in July, and the contract she had read at his kitchen table, and the October night on her porch and the March morning when he put his mother's ring on her finger in the cold dawn and said he had been carrying it for 6 weeks. "I think," she said, "that there is not a single thing about my life that I would change." He turned to look at her and she looked back at him, this man who had asked for slowness and honored it, this cowboy she had told herself she would never love, this person who had simply, persistently, honestly changed her mind. "Not even me?" he asked, and she heard the smallest, warmest edge of teasing in his voice. "Especially not you," she said. He reached over and took her hand in the cold night air, and they sat like that while the stars wheeled in their great patient arcs over the Texas Valley, and the coals in the house glowed, and their children slept the deep certain sleep of children who are safe, and the creek moved over its stones in the dark, and the prairie verbena waited under the cold ground for spring, which would come as it always came, slow and certain, and without asking permission. A year later, in the December of 1878, with Clara walking steadily and Robert talking in complete sentences about horses and cattle, and everything he observed with his mother's precise, evaluating attention, with Coldwater Creek grown to 600 residents, and a new schoolhouse, and a telegraph office that worked reliably 3 days out of 5, with Petra well advanced in her medical training and showing every sign of becoming an excellent physician in her own right. With the Harmon family thriving and Dollar's Vegas school full of bright children and Florence Finley's pine boughs over the door, and the cracked bell doing its flat best in the cold night air, Maria sat at the kitchen table of the quarter circle after the children were in bed and Louis was still outside checking the horses, a habit that was as much meditation as practical work, and she wrote a letter to Dr. Elias Crane in St. Louis. She had written him periodically since her arrival, reporting on her work, the cases she had treated, the conditions of life on the frontier, the particular medical challenges of a rural Texas practice with limited resources and unlimited need. He had written back with equal regularity, proud and interested, and occasionally sending medical journals or supplies she could not get locally. He had become, in the years since she had left his practice, something closer to a colleague than a mentor, which she thought was the proper trajectory of a good mentorship. She told him about her year. She told him about Clara and Robert and the growth of the practice and Petra's progress and the town council and the new railhead at Garner's Crossing. She told him that she had delivered 9 babies in the past year, all of them alive and well, which she considered one of the finest things she could say about any year. She told him about the valley and the winter and the stars. And at the end, because it felt like the thing the letter was really about, she told him something she had not quite said to anyone, not even to Louis, because some recognitions are private before they are spoken. She wrote, "I came here with a promise to myself and a list of things I would not allow. I was very certain about what I would and would not do, and certainty, I have learned, is only useful if it bends when the evidence requires it to. I am grateful that mine did. I am grateful for the work, which is more than I hoped it would be. I am grateful for the valley and the community I have found in it. I am grateful for my children. And I am grateful for a man who heard my certainty and said, calmly and without pressure, that he would change my mind slowly, and then kept his word, and let me arrive at my own understanding in my own time, which is the only way any understanding worth having ever truly arrives." She sealed the letter and set it by the door to take to the telegraph office in the morning, and she went to the window and looked out at the dark ranch, the barn with the line of lamplight under the door where Louis was settling the horses for the night, the pastures dark and quiet, the creek somewhere in the dark making its patient sound over the stones, the stars in their unreasonable abundance overhead. Louis came in a few minutes later, bringing the cold night air in with him, stamping his boots at the door. He saw her at the window and crossed the room and put his arms around her from behind, and they stood together looking out at the night and the valley that was theirs. "Horses are settled," he said. "Good," she said. They were quiet for a moment. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She turned inside his arms and looked at him, at the familiar face that she had been learning for 3.5 years and expected to keep learning for all the years that came after, and she thought about what she had just written to Dr. Crane about certainty and bending and arriving in your own time, and she smiled. "I am thinking," she said, "that I am the luckiest stubborn woman in the state of Texas." He laughed, and the sound of it filled the warm kitchen of the quarter circle, their children sleeping down the hall, their life assembled around them in all its particular, ordinary, irreplaceable beauty. "I can live with that," he said. He kissed her in the lamplight, and the stars were outside the window, and the creek was running in the dark, and the prairie verbena would bloom again in spring, and the future stretched before them, not as a wound or a door or a risk, but simply as the continuing life of two people who had found each other slowly, honestly, and with the kind of love that does not announce itself but simply remains, year after year, as steady and particular as a ranch on a creek road, 8 miles east of a small Texas town. Built by one man's hands and tended by two people's love, and meant, from the moment they chose it, to endure. The winter deepened over Coldwater Creek and the valley slept under cold, clean skies, And in the spring, the verbena came back along the creek road the way it always did, small and blue-purple and persistent, as if it had been waiting all the cold months to come back and be itself, which of course it had, which is the great reliable truth about things that are rooted, that no winter is long enough to take them, that they will return, year after year, patient and certain, exactly where you left them.